Hello, everyone. I thought I would go through the week 3 study questions just to supplement what we did in the live session. On the first page, sorry about that, the authors say, quote, "It is not unreasonable in certain cases to regard one's own death as a bad thing for oneself." What would Epicurus say to this? Why? I think it's pretty clear that he would say that it is never reasonable. It is always unreasonable, then, to regard one's own death as a bad thing for oneself. And that is because death is the end of all awareness, the privation of all awareness, taking away of all consciousness, the taking away of all sensation. So death can't hurt us, so death can't be a bad thing. I think that would be the quick Epicurean answer. So this question was just designed to make it clear that the authors are, in this respect, anti-Epicureans. Number 2, at the bottom of the first page of the essay, the authors explain how, if death indeed is a bad for the person who dies, what kind of bad it would be. How do they characterize the kind of bad it would be? As somebody said in today's session, it would be an unexperienced bad. Just the way they characterize the kind of bads that Nagel is really getting at in his essay. Things that are bad for somebody but are not experienced as bad by them. Number 3, what do the authors mean when they say we normally have asymmetric attitudes towards prenatal non-existence and posthumous non-existence, or death? Well, it means that we treat them differently. We do not treat them symmetrically. I guess to treat them symmetrically would be to treat them the same and to give them equal value. To treat them asymmetrically is to treat them differently and to assign them different values. Number 4, the authors explain that posthumous non-existence can be seen as a period of deprivation, because had we not died when we did, but later, we would have gone on to experience more of the goods of life. How do they suggest that prenatal non-existence can be seen as a period of deprivation? The key here is that they believe that whenever we were born, we could have been born earlier and therefore experienced more of the goods of life. So what they're basically doing is extending that to prenatal non-existence, what we sort of been taking for granted since Nagel with posthumous non-existence. So it really does depend upon the idea that we could have been born earlier than we were, and we would remain the same person, and we would have experienced more of the goods of life because we would have had more life. Just as, it's a parallel to the idea we would have had more life had we lived longer. We would have had more life had we been born earlier, or if we had died later or been born earlier. In both cases, we would have more of the goods of life. So the fact that we weren't born earlier than we were means that, to some extent, in some way, we were deprived of the goods of life. Number 5, explain why Epicurus would say that the only rational attitude toward prenatal and posthumous non-existence is to regard them as having the same value. I think Epicurus would say again that since we're talking about the privation of all awareness, the taking away, the absence of all consciousness, in both cases, that since our prenatal non-existence is nothing to us and our posthumous non-existence is nothing to us, then we should be indifferent to both of them. What is the asymmetry problem? What would it mean to solve the asymmetry problem? The asymmetry problem is that we treat prenatal and posthumous non-existence differently. It's a problem because, to the Epicurean, it's a problem because we should treat them as having the same value, but we don't. So the problem is that we're irrational. So to solve the problem would mean to prove the rationality of the asymmetrical treatment. That is, to solve the asymmetry problem would be to justify the asymmetrical treatment in a rational way by saying that there is indeed something different about the two periods of non-existence, which gives them different values. And we know that the start of that is to point out that the fact that the deprivations of posthumous non-existence are in the future, whereas the deprivations of prenatal non-existence are in the past, is really the start of the argument that they do indeed have relevant differences between them, which might justify our asymmetrical treatment. Number 7, why do the authors reject Nagel's solution to the asymmetry problem? Basically because they don't buy the idea that the date of your birth or the time of your birth is an essential characteristic of you. So that if you change the date of your birth, even if you change it significantly, let's say by 5 or 10 years, that does not mean that you would be a different person. Nagel's argument rests on the idea that if we had been born earlier than we were in any sort of substantial way, we would be a different person. And so it would be impossible to be born earlier than we were and still be the same person, so it doesn't make sense to regret an impossibility. They reject that because they seem to think that rests on the idea that the time of your birth is an essential feature of you. And it's not. They say it's not clear at all that that's true. It might be true, but Nagel doesn't prove it. So they feel free to reject that and go with the opposite hypothesis. What is Parfit's hypothetical on page 215 meant to prove? Without looking at it, I'm just going to assume that that's the first hypothetical about waking up in the hospital and hoping that you have had 10 hours of pain rather than that you will have 1 hour of pain. It's meant to prove that we like our bads in the past rather than the future, that we prefer. That's really the better way of putting it, that we prefer to have our bads in the past rather than to have them in the future. Why do the authors think that Parfit's hypothetical does not apply to a bad like death? Because Parfit's hypothetical, the one I just referred to in the last question, only applies to experienced bads. That is, things that are bad for somebody that are experienced as bad by them. Death is an unexperienced bad, not an experienced bad. It's a bad, but it's not experienced as bad by us. And so they point out that, at least according to their claim, and this goes to number 10, this is meant, Parfit's second hypothetical is meant to establish that when it comes to unexperienced bads, that is, things that we recognize as bads, but are not experienced as bad by us, that we, normally speaking, are indifferent to whether they're in the past or the future. One can think of a betrayal that we never found out about. Say that, well, here's your choice. It's either that you have been betrayed in the past but never found out about it, or you will be betrayed in the future and never find out about it. Their idea is that we wouldn't care. It would be equally bad. We would care about being betrayed, but we wouldn't care about whether it was in the past or the future. What this is meant to establish is that when it comes to unexperienced bads, we are indifferent to whether in the past or the future, which again brings up a problem for asymmetry, because if we usually are indifferent to whether our unexperienced bads are in the past or the future, we should be indifferent to whether our non-existence is posthumous or prenatal, and we're not. We care a lot about posthumous non-existence, a lot more than we care about prenatal non-existence. But if those are, both of them, unexperienced bads, then to be consistent with our regular behavior, our regular attitudes, we should regard them as having the same value. We shouldn't care. So that leads to their final suggestion for how to solve the asymmetry problem. And that has to do, as we said, with focusing on pleasures and goods. This goes to the question for the second set of study questions, just a single question. Not yet being born deprived us of pleasures we would have had we been born earlier than we were. That's really what they're hypothesizing. Dying will deprive us of pleasures we will experience if we died later than we actually will. Sorry, if we die later. A little confused there. Why do the authors think it's rational to care more about the latter than the former? That is, why is it rational to care more about the pleasures? Why is it rational to care more about the deprivation of pleasures that will be caused by our deaths rather than the deprivations of pleasures that have been caused by the fact that we weren't born earlier? Well, just because in general we like our pleasures to be in the future. We would prefer to have our pleasures in the future. Pleasures in the future mean more to us than pleasures in the past. So the deprivation, the taking away of those pleasures, is bound to mean more to us if they're taking away in the future than having been taken away in the past.